In the winter of 1943, along a desolate mountain pass in Tunisia, the American army received its baptism by fire, and the lesson was written in blood. At Kasserine Pass, German panzers commanded by veterans of the Russian front tore through grain. American units like a scythe through wheat. Entire battalions broke and ran. Tanks were abandoned. Command posts were overrun. The British, who had been fighting since 1939, watched with a mixture of sympathy and concern, wondering if these Americans, so confident in their industrial might, possessed the fighting spirit to stand against the Wehrmacht. The Germans themselves were contemptuous, dismissing the American soldier as soft, undisciplined, a shopkeeper in uniform. But something remarkable was about to happen, something that would define the character of the American military for generations to come. The United States Army was about to demonstrate a capacity for rapid adaptation, for learning from failure, for institutional self-correction. That would prove unprecedented among all the Allied armies of the Second World War. This is the story of that transformation, of how a nation that fielded an army smaller than Portugal's in 1939 would, by 1945, project military power across two oceans, simultaneously, and defeat the two most formidable military machines the world had ever seen. It is a story not merely of courage, though courage there was in abundance, but of something more profound, the application of American pragmatism, mechanical aptitude, and democratic values to the ancient art of war. The American army that stumbled at Kasserine Pass was, in many ways, an amateur force, while the Germans had been perfecting combined arms doctrine since the Spanish Civil War, while the British had been blooded in North Africa, and the Soviets had suffered catastrophic losses learning to fight the Nazi invader, the United States. Army had spent the interwar years as little more than a constabulary force, scattered across frontier posts, starved of funding, equipped with obsolete weapons. In 1939, the United States Army ranks 17th in the world in size, behind Romania. Its tanks were riveted death traps that couldn't penetrate German armor. Its doctrine was largely theoretical. Its officers had studied war in classrooms at Leavenworth and West Point, but precious few had ever commanded men in combat. The expansion from 1940 onward was breathtaking, in scale but chaotic in execution. Citizen soldiers were drafted by the millions. Officers were commissioned by the thousands. And the whole vast machine was expected to not merely fight but to win, against enemies who had been preparing for this war for a decade. The miracle is not that the Americans stumbled at first, but that they learned so quickly from their mistakes. Within months of Kasserine Pass, the same units that had broken were holding their ground. Within a year, they were attacking with skill and confidence. The question that has fascinated military historians ever since is simple. How? The answer begins not on the battlefield, but on the farms and in the small towns of Depression-era America, the American soldier of World War II grew up in a culture of mechanical improvisation that was unique in the world. He had learned to fix the family Ford when it broke down on a dirt road miles from the nearest town. He had kept the tractor running through harvest season with baling wire and ingenuity. He understood engines not as mysterious devices to be serviced by specialists, but as machines that could be understood, taken apart, and made to work again. This was not a trivial advantage. The American Army in World War II was the most mechanized force ever fielded. It moved on trucks, fought in tanks, communicated by radio, and was supplied by a logistics chain that depended entirely on keeping tens of thousands of vehicles operational under the most adverse conditions imaginable. The American soldiers. Mechanical aptitude meant that when a half-track through a track in the Norman hedgerows, the crew could fix it. When a Sherman tank's engine failed during the drive across France, the crew didn't wait for mechanics from the rear. They pulled the engine themselves. This stands in stark contrast to other armies. The British Army, for all its courage and professionalism, was still organized along class lines that dated to the Victorian era. Maintenance was the job of the Royal Army Service Corps, not the fighting soldier. Officers came overwhelmingly from the public schools and couldn't be expected to soil their hands with spanners and grease. The Soviet Army, forged in the fires of industrialization and war, produced soldiers who could endure unimaginable hardship, but its doctrine emphasized mass and momentum over individual initiative. Repairs were centralized. Deviation from orders was dangerous. The German army, despite its reputation for excellence, was actually less mechanized than the American army. The Wehrmacht moved on horses, millions of them, and its logistics were a constant crisis. The Americans, by contrast, had created a military that could fight and fix itself simultaneously, a force that treated mechanical breakdown not as a crisis but as a problem to be solved by soldiers in the field. But mechanical aptitude alone does not win wars. What truly set the American military apart was its willingness, indeed its eagerness, to learn from failure and to act on those lessons with ruthless speed. In the wake of Kasserine Pass, General Dwight Eisenhower and General George Marshall did something that would have been unthinkable in most armies. They relieved commanders wholesale. The two-corps commander was replaced. Division commanders were replaced. Officers who had looked good in peacetime but failed under fire were sent home, regardless of their seniority or their connections. In their place came younger men, combat leaders who had proven themselves at lower levels. Men like Matthew Ridgway, who had commanded the 82nd Airborne with skill and dash. Men like James Gavin, who would become the youngest division commander in the American Army. Men like Terry Allen and Lucian Truscott, aggressive fighters who understood that initiative wins battles. This was meritocracy in action, and it was profoundly American. The British Army, bound by tradition and the old-school tie, found it far more difficult to relieve. Commanders who came from the right families and the right regiments, the Soviet Army under Stalin, made relief a matter of political reliability as much as military competence. And generals knew that failure could mean not just dismissal but execution. The German army, despite its professional excellence, was increasingly hamstrung by Hitler's interference and by a rigid doctrine that had served well in the early war but was increasingly obsolete. The Americans, by contrast, created a culture that rewarded results. If a commander could fight, his background didn't matter. If he couldn't fight, his connections wouldn't save him. This was not always fair, and it was often painful, but it worked. By the time of the Normandy invasion, the American army was led by officers who had proven themselves in combat, who understood their men, and who were willing to take risks. The American capacity for adaptation extended beyond personnel to tactics and doctrine. Consider the problem of artillery. At the start of the war, American artillery was good, but it was employed in the traditional manner. Batteries fired at pre-planned targets. Coordination was cumbersome, and response time was slow. Then American gunners developed a technique called time on target, or TOT. The concept was simple but devastating in execution. Multiple artillery battalions, sometimes entire divisions of artillery, would calculate their fire missions so that shells from guns miles apart, would land on the target at precisely the same instant. There would be no warning, no ranging shots for the enemy to take cover from. One moment there would be silence, the next a cataclysm of high explosive and steel. German soldiers who survived TOT barrages spoke of them with awe and terror. The ground would simply erupt in a maelstrom of fire, and an entire position could be obliterated in seconds. This was not technology. The guns were conventional. This was mathematics and coordination and a willingness to experiment with new methods. The American artillery arm became, by war's end, the most feared in the world. And German veterans would later say they could endure American infantry and American tanks. But American artillery was hell itself. Similarly, the Americans revolutionized the use of tactical air power. In the fluid fighting across France after the breakout from Normandy, American ground commanders developed the system of forward air controllers, officers on the ground with radios who could talk directly to fighter bombers overhead and direct them onto targets in real time. This required trust, decentralization of authority, and split-second coordination. It required that captains and majors be trusted to make decisions that in other armies would be reserved for colonels or generals. The results were spectacular. German panzer columns that had survived years on the Eastern Front were torn apart in the open country of France by P-47. Thunderbolts guided onto target by young American officers with radios and jeeps. The Germans had nothing comparable. The British and Canadians developed similar systems, but more slowly and with more bureaucratic friction. The Soviets, despite fielding enormous air forces, never achieved the same level of tactical integration. The Americans, drawing on their culture of individual initiative and their faith in junior leaders, created a system that multiplied their combat power immeasurably. Underlying all of this was something even more fundamental: logistics. The American Army's ability to supply itself across thousands of miles of ocean, and then across hundreds of miles of liberated but devastated Europe was the foundation upon which all else rested. No other nation could have done it. The famous Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that supplied Patton's Third Army during its race across France in the summer of 1944, moved 4,000 tons of supplies a day over a one-way loop of French highways. The trucks ran 24 hours a day. Drivers, many of them African-American soldiers from quartermaster units, pushed themselves to exhaustion and beyond, knowing that every gallon of gasoline and every shell they delivered meant another mile closer to Berlin. When the trucks broke down, they were fixed on the spot or pushed off the road and replaced. The system was improvised, chaotic, and magnificent. It kept entire armies moving at a pace that stunned the Germans. American industrial might was the engine of this logistics miracle. But American adaptability was the transmission. When port facilities were inadequate, the Americans built artificial harbors on the beaches of Normandy. When rail lines were destroyed, they trucked supplies instead. When winter closed the ports, they flew supplies in. Problems were seen not as insurmountable obstacles but as challenges to be overcome through ingenuity and sheer determination. The contrast with other armies is striking. The German army's logistics were in constant crisis, dependent on dwindling fuel supplies and a rail network being systematically destroyed by Allied bombers. By late 1944, German panzer divisions would launch offensives and literally run out of fuel within days. The Soviets, despite their enormous production, struggled to supply their armies as they advanced into Eastern Europe. and their logistics relied heavily on American trucks provided through Lend-Lease. The British, supplied by American shipping and rationed by the necessities of a besieged island, could never match the Americans in sheer logistical mass. The Americans turned logistics into a weapon of war, and it was as decisive as any tank or bomber. All of this raises a deeper question. Why? Why was the American army capable of this rapid adaptation when others were not? Part of the answer lies in American culture itself, in the democratic and pragmatic values that shaped American society. The American army was not a caste system or a political instrument. It was, fundamentally, an organization of citizens temporarily under arms. The soldiers and officers came from every background, every region, every social class. A farm boy from Iowa might serve under a lawyer from New York, who in turn answered to a factory worker from Michigan who had proven himself as a sergeant. This was not perfect. The army was still segregated by race, and women were largely excluded from combat roles. But it was far more egalitarian than any European army, and this mattered. Ideas could come from anywhere. A private with a suggestion could be listened to. A lieutenant with a better way to attack a position could see his method adopted. There was no centuries-old tradition, dictating that only gentlemen could lead or that doctrine handed down from previous wars was sacred. The American army was young enough and democratic enough to be flexible, to see warfare as a problem to be solved rather than a ritual to be enacted. This extended to the highest levels of command. Eisenhower, the supreme commander, was a staff officer who had never heard a shot fired in anger before. 1942, but he was a brilliant organizer and coalition leader. Bradley, the commander of the 12th Army Group, was a mild-mannered schoolteacher in uniform, but he was a careful planner and a steady hand. Patton, for all his bluster and profanity, was a deep student of military history and a master of mobile warfare. These men did not come from a military aristocracy. They had risen through talent and hard work in an army that valued results. And crucially, they were backed by a political leadership, by Roosevelt and Marshall and Stimson, who understood that modern war required mobilizing the entire nation, not just its military. There is also the question of national character, though this is dangerous ground for historians to tread. Yet there is something to be said for the role of American optimism and confidence in this story. The American soldier believed he came from a superior system, not because of race or breeding, but because democracy and free enterprise produced better ideas, better equipment, and better methods. This was not arrogance, or not entirely. It was a faith that problems could be solved, that setbacks were temporary, that intelligence and effort would prevail. When the Sherman tank proved inferior to the German Panther and Tiger, the American answer was not despair but innovation. Tank destroyers to hunt enemy armor, artillery and air support to suppress it, and sheer numbers to overwhelm it. When the hedgerows of Normandy turned into killing fields, an American sergeant welded steel, prongs onto the front of Sherman to cut through the hedges, and within weeks, hundreds of tanks were so equipped. The Germans fought with skill and courage born of desperation, knowing their homeland was doomed. The Soviets fought with a grim determination born of suffering. The British fought with a weary professionalism born of 5 years of war. The Americans fought with an energy and inventiveness born of the belief that they could win, would win, and that the methods to achieve victory were there to be discovered. This was the learning curve of democracy in action, the faith that free people, given the tools and the trust, could master any challenge. By the spring of 1945, the transformation was complete. The American army that crossed the Rhine was unrecognizable from the force that had stumbled in Tunisia 2 years before. It was a flexible, mechanized juggernaut capable of moving hundreds of miles in weeks, of crushing German resistance with overwhelming firepower, of adapting to any battlefield, challenge from urban warfare in Aachen to river crossings on the Rhine. Its soldiers were confident, its officers were experienced, and its logistics were unmatched. When the American and Soviet armies met at the Elbe River in April of 1945, the contrast was visible. The Soviets had won their victory through mass and sacrifice, through the blood of millions and a ruthless application of force. The Americans had won through industrial might and institutional learning, through a system that turned citizen soldiers into effective fighters in months rather than years. Both victories were real, both were hard-won, but they reflected profoundly different societies and different approaches to war. The American way of war in World War II was not perfect. Mistakes were made, opportunities were lost, and the cost in lives was grievous. But the speed with which the American military learned and adapted, the willingness to question doctrine and relieve commanders and try new methods, was extraordinary. It reflected the best of American values: pragmatism over dogma, merit over class, innovation over tradition, and it offers lessons that remain relevant long after the guns fell silent. In an age of rapid technological change and unpredictable threats, the ability to learn quickly, to adapt to new realities, to trust junior leaders and reward initiative, remains as vital as it was in the fields of France and the forests of Germany 8 decades ago. The learning curve of democracy was steep, but the Americans climbed it faster than anyone thought possible. And in doing so, they helped to save the world. The story of the American military's adaptation in World War II is not merely a tale of institutional efficiency or technological superiority. It is fundamentally a story about the kind of army that a democratic society produces when it goes to war. The contrast with the totalitarian powers is instructive and revealing. The German army, the Wehrmacht, was in many ways the most professionally competent military force in the world in 1939. Its officer corps had been trained in the rigorous Prussian tradition. Its doctrine of combined arms warfare was revolutionary, and its early victories seemed to confirm that it was invincible. Yet by 1943, that same army was becoming rigid and brittle. Hitler's interference in operational decisions grew increasingly erratic and destructive. The officer corps, bound by oath and tradition, found it nearly impossible to question orders even when those orders were manifestly insane. The German army fought with extraordinary skill and courage to the very end, but it could not adapt to the reality of a two-front war against enemies with overwhelming material superiority. It could not innovate fast enough, could not replace its losses, and could not overcome the fundamental weakness of a system built on the cult of personality and racial ideology. The Soviet army, by contrast, did adapt, but at a cost that beggars imagination. The Red Army of 1941, purged of its best officers by Stalin's paranoia, was nearly destroyed in the first months of the German invasion. Entire army groups were encircled and annihilated. Millions of Soviet soldiers died or were captured. But the Soviet Union survived through sheer mass, through the willingness to trade space for time, and through an industrial evacuation that moved entire factories beyond the Urals. By 1943, the Red Army had learned to fight the Germans on equal terms, and by 1944, it was driving them back with overwhelming force. Yet this learning came at a cost of perhaps 20 million Soviet dead, military and civilian. The Soviet system could absorb losses that would have destroyed any other nation, but it could not foster the kind of individual initiative and decentralized decision-making that characterized the American army. Soviet doctrine emphasized mass and momentum. Artillery was massed in concentrations that dwarfed anything the Americans employed. Tank armies were used as hammers to smash through German lines. But Soviet junior officers and NCOs were not encouraged to improvise or to question orders. And the price of failure was not merely relief but often imprisonment or execution. The British and Commonwealth forces present yet another model. The British Army in 1939 was small but professional, an imperial constabulary scattered across the globe. By 1945, Britain had mobilized millions and fought on every continent. British soldiers and their Commonwealth comrades from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and Africa fought with skill and determination from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma. Yet the British military was constrained in ways the Americans were not. Britain was a nation under siege, its cities bombed, its shipping attacked, its resources stretched to breaking. The British could not afford the lavish expenditure of ammunition that American forces took for granted. British infantry advanced with careful artillery plans and limited objectives because they could not replace casualties as quickly as the Americans. The British class system, for all the democratizing effects of total war, still shaped the army's culture. Officers still came disproportionately from the public schools and the old regiments. Promotion was slower and more dependent on seniority. Innovation happened, certainly. The British developed excellent specialized units like the Commandos and the Long Range Desert Group, and British intelligence and special operations were superb. But the institutional culture was more conservative, more bound by tradition than the American. The result was an army that was steady and reliable, but less capable of rapid adaptation than the Americans proved to be. When Montgomery, the most successful British field commander, planned an operation, it was meticulously prepared, carefully supplied, and methodically executed. When Patton planned an operation, he launched it immediately, trusted his subordinates to solve problems as they arose, and drove forward regardless of risks. Both methods worked, but they reflected profoundly different military cultures. The American advantage in adaptation was also a function of geography and resources. The United States was never bombed, never invaded, never faced the existential threat that Britain endured or the apocalyptic devastation that befell the Soviet Union and Germany. American factories ran 3 shifts a day without fear of air attack. American farms produced food in abundance while Europe starved. American cities were not reduced to rubble. This meant that the United States could afford to experiment, to fail, to try new approaches without risking national survival. A military innovation that failed in the field could be quickly replaced with something better because the industrial base was untouched and the supply of manpower seemed inexhaustible. This was not simply a matter of material wealth, though wealth certainly mattered. It was also a matter of mental space. American commanders could think about how to win the war, not merely how to survive another week. They could plan offensives rather than desperately shore up defenses. They could afford to relieve commanders who weren't performing because there were always more officers in the pipeline. The luxury of fighting a war far from home, supplied by an untouchable industrial base, gave the Americans an advantage in adaptation that cannot be overstated. The British were fighting for survival. The Soviets were fighting a war of extermination on their own soil. The Americans were fighting to win. And that psychological difference shaped everything. Yet we must be careful not to romanticize or oversimplify. The American Army's learning curve, rapid though it was involved real failures and real costs. The Battle of the Hurtgen Forest in the autumn of 1944 was a bloody debacle. American divisions chewed up in impossible terrain attacking objectives of dubious value. The initial response to the German Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, saw American units overrun and entire regiments forced to surrender. Airborne operations, for all their daring, were often poorly planned and horrifically costly. The Market Garden operation in Holland in September 1944 was a British-led disaster, but American paratroopers paid a heavy price for it. The American Army made mistakes throughout the war, and soldiers died because of those mistakes. What distinguished the American military was not that it didn't make mistakes, but that it learned from them quickly and didn't repeat them. After the Hurtgen Forest, tactics for forest fighting were revised. After the Bulge, intelligence procedures were overhauled to prevent strategic surprise. After each airborne operation, lessons were captured and disseminated. The American military created a culture of after-action reviews, of constantly analyzing what had worked and what hadn't, of sharing lessons learned across units and theaters. This was not glamorous work, but it was essential. Staff officers compiled reports, training was updated, doctrine was revised. The system learned, even when the cost of the lesson was measured in lives. The final element in understanding the American military's rapid adaptation is leadership at the very highest level. The partnership between George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, and Franklin Roosevelt, the Commander-in-Chief. Marshall understood that modern war required a different kind of army than the United States had ever fielded. He fought to expand the officer corps rapidly, to establish training programs that emphasized realistic combat conditions, to create an industrial mobilization that could supply not just the American military, but the Allies as well. He protected his commanders in the field from political interference while holding them accountable for results. He built a staff system that could manage a global war across multiple theaters simultaneously. Roosevelt, for his part, understood the strategic requirements of coalition warfare and gave Marshall the support he needed. The American military in World War II was not micromanaged by politicians in the way that Hitler controlled the Wehrmacht or Stalin controlled the Red Army. Eisenhower and his fellow theater commanders had genuine authority to make decisions, to shift resources, to pursue opportunities. This decentralization of authority extended all the way down the chain of command, from theater commanders to army commanders to division commanders to company commanders. An American infantry captain attacking a German position had more authority to make tactical decisions, to call for artillery or air support, to shift his plan based on what he saw, than his German counterpart did by 1944. The German army, once the master of decentralized warfare, had become increasingly rigid as Hitler's grip tightened. The American army, learning on the job, had become more flexible. This paradox is one of the most striking aspects of the war. The Democratic Army became more adaptive than the totalitarian one. In the end, the American military's rapid adaptation in World War II reflected the nation that created it. It was pragmatic rather than ideological, innovative rather than traditional, confident without being complacent. It valued results over ritual, merit over birth, initiative over obedience. It could learn from failure because failure was not a crime but a lesson. It could promote the talented and relieve the incompetent, because no one's position was guaranteed by class or party membership. It could experiment with new tactics and technologies because the industrial base could support that experimentation, and the culture encouraged it. and it could mobilize the energy and intelligence of an entire diverse nation, because the society was democratic enough, despite its imperfections, to give millions of ordinary citizens a stake in victory. The American army that won World War II was not a perfect instrument, and the society that created it was not a perfect democracy. Racial segregation remained official policy throughout the war. Japanese Americans were interned, and women were largely excluded from combat roles. These were profound moral failures that compromised the very democratic values the nation claimed to be fighting for. Yet even with these failures, the American military demonstrated a capacity for institutional learning and adaptation that was unmatched. In 20 months, from Kasserine Pass in February 1943 to the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the American army transformed itself from a force that broke under pressure to a force that could challenge the Wehrmacht on equal terms. In another 10 months, from Normandy to the German surrender in May 1945, that same army crossed France, breached the Siegfried Line, crossed the Rhine, and overran Germany. The learning curve was steep and bloody, but the Americans climbed it faster than any army had ever done. That achievement, born of democratic values and pragmatic innovation, remains one of the most remarkable military accomplishments of the 20th century, and its lessons endure.